So the Bad Batch has given us a pretty good look at a little secret that the Separatists had. They had a fairly large war chest, a sort of collection of loot that they had gathered from both their enemies and their allies alike, and I figured today we could take a closer look at exactly what that war chest is, how the Separatists had acquired it, and the role it may play in the new galactic empire. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. So the Bad Batch has shown us that the Separatists did indeed have a fairly large amount of war loot at the end of the Clone Wars, which was held personally by Count Dooku at his facility on Serenno, his palace. And what we saw in the show is that after the end of the war, this war loot became of particular interest to the Galactic Empire, with clone troopers being dispatched to gather this loot up. Now, this aspect isn't really surprising. After the Empire won the Clone Wars, technically, the Separatist war loot would have been fair game, and the Empire wanting to seize it and use it for its own means actually makes perfect sense. The questions come up about how this war loot was acquired. Now, some of it's pretty obvious. I'm sure a lot of it was gathered during Separatist offensives during the early to mid periods of the war, when the Separatists were venturing deeper and deeper into Republic territory. In fact, it really wasn't until the end of the war that these Separatist offensives stopped. While they were primarily on a defensive role throughout basically the entirety of the conflict, they were really almost entirely in a defensive role for the last third of the war, with the exception of a few key offensives like the assault on Coruscant in the final days of the conflict. So a lot of this war loot likely came from the worlds the Separatists conquered and briefly held. In fact, we can see during the Battle of Ryloth, as Republic forces are nearing the Separatist command centers, the sort of valuables of the local culture were being loaded onto Separatist transports and shipped off the planet. This is, in fact, one of the reasons why Wat Tambor was captured during the Battle of Ryloth. He stayed behind to ensure that the loot that the Separatists were collecting made it off-world, and as a result was captured by the Jedi. And I'm sure this kind of situation repeated itself on a lot of worlds across the galaxy throughout the duration of the conflict. For example, I bet there was loot taken, although we never see it on screen, from Onderon during the fairly brief Separatist occupation of that world. Now, albeit that world wasn't occupied by a flat-out Separatist invasion like Ryloth, and was instead sort of taken over by internal influence carried out by Separatist sympathizers on the world, it was still briefly under the control of the Separatist military until local guerrilla forces were able to overthrow the local government that was supporting the Separatists. So those are the obvious sources of this wealth, coming in from governments that had been conquered by the Separatists or worlds that had ended up in the path of Separatist offensives during the war. But that's only one of the sources that we know about. In fact, we see during that episode of The Bad Batch that locals are insisting that the Separatists actually took a good portion of that wealth from local populations on Serenno and likely across Separatist space. It's likely that a lot of those were taxes. I would imagine that a good portion of those goods were shipped off to Separatist centers to sort of fund the war effort, and they just ended up in this large stockpile. On top of that, I'm sure a lot of those goods were cultural artifacts and things of historic importance to local populations. These could have been collected for their own protection, saying that if Republic forces started to push deeper and deeper into Separatist territory, something they did during the later days of the war, that it would be safer to take the historic relics of these worlds and put them on Serenno for safekeeping, so the Republic wouldn't commandeer them and take them as their own war loot, something that we don't know whether or not the Republic was doing. But ultimately, the end result is that this vast quantity of wealth from mostly the Outer Rim ended up on Serenno, being stored at the palace on Serenno, the official residence of Count Dooku. And following his death during the Battle of Coruscant and the subsequent Separatist surrender following the execution of Order 66, the death of General Grievous, and the successes in the Outer Rim sieges, the treasure was simply left abandoned. It appears at this point that Imperial Venator-class Star Destroyers would have positioned themselves above Serenno and carried out a substantial orbital bombardment. This orbital bombardment would have laid waste to population centers there, forcing any survivors to go and hide in the woods. This orbital bombardment was likely part of an extensive campaign carried out by the Galactic Empire to suppress any pro-Separatist sentiment in formerly Separatist worlds, things like Raxus, for example, which we saw in Season 1. And it's likely that the only part of Serrano that was spared from this bombardment was the palace itself, likely because the Empire saw the potential for seizing the spoils of war from the Separatists. And it doesn't take a genius to understand what the Empire wanted to do with these goods. They likely wanted to ship them off and sell them for their raw materials, or basically for their raw value, and use the proceeds to fund military expansion programs, things like new lines of Imperial-class Star Destroyers, new armor for their now stormtroopers, and a large array of other military equipment that would be utilized by the Galactic Empire, including the early phases of the construction of the Death Star. All in all, the presence of this large mass of loot, this war chest, is an interesting aspect of the galaxy at the end of the war. It's an interesting objective for rebel factions and the Galactic Empire to sort of battle over. There's a lot of potential in that sheer quantity of financial goods. And it would have funded transitions within the Imperial military, like the transition from the Republic Navy to the Imperial Navy, and if you'd like to learn about that transition, I'll leave a link up here to a video I have on that. And I'd like you to let me know down in the comments whether you think I'm right about how this war chest was collected, particularly how it was collected from Separatist citizens. Do you think they were told things like, hey, this is just being taken for safekeeping? Or do you think they were flat out told, yeah, no, we need this for the war effort, so you're going to give that to us now? And I'd also like you to let me know down below if you have anything else you'd like to see me cover in Star Wars. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.